We took some time. We did some camping while we were gone. Our family enjoys being out in the woods a little bit, so we went and did some camping. And, it's fun watching the development of my kids over the years, right? Kids grow up, and as they grow, they get a little bit more freedoms, right? Sometimes you got to pull some of them back. But it was fun this year to watch Ezra. He's 6 now, and he got some additional privileges as we were out camping this year. It was fun to watch him. He's 6, and so we're in this little loop, and there's some kids in our loop at the campground, so you can go hang out with them. You just can't go in tents and trailers and all that kind of stuff. We just stay with them, stay outside, play, have fun. And so there's this group of like 10 or 15 kids that were running around, and it was fun to watch. They were up there, they were playing cops and robbers, and like as the inner kid in me is like, oh man, I loved doing that as a kid. And so they're up there, they're playing cops and robbers, and Audrey and I were sitting around the campfire with my mom and stepdad, and we're sitting there, and Audrey all of a sudden is like, have you seen Ezra recently? I was like, no, have you? And she's like, will you go check on him? Because as a parent, there's like that concern of like, we're giving them a little bit of freedom, but what if they abuse that freedom? Or what if, God forbid, something crazy happens and some person comes into play, and all those things, start running through your mind. So I got up and I walked around the corner, and what probably my favorite memory of my time away is I see my son with this handcuffs, these steel handcuffs in his hand, as he is full speed running after some other kid. I'm gonna get you! And so I was just like, he's good. And so I walked back, and so that way, I enjoyed that element of it. He got to experience doing something new, right? Doing something new can be a lot of fun, but for us as parents, there was a little bit of fear involved. Like, can we trust him to make the right choices? Can we trust him to be with the right people and not go where we said you can't go, right? We tried that with our 4-year-old, and that freedom was removed pretty quickly. Because we realize she's 4 and you can't do that. But what happens is we get a little bit of freedom, right? And parents, they care about their kids, right? And so if you don't know where your kids are for an extended period of time, there's kind of this fear that begins to well up and rise up inside of you, right? And fear, though, it's not just something that parents deal with. Fear is something that we all deal with in different situations, different scenarios in our life. And if we're not careful and if we don't think through all the layers of it, fear can end up paralyzing us. We just get stuck in this fear, paralyzed, unable to move, unable to do anything. And because we get stuck in this paralyzing fear, we don't get the opportunity to grow in our faith because of it. So today we're starting a new series called Reckless.
Your family is
Yeah, thank you. A new series called Reckless. We're going to be looking at the life of Peter over the next couple of weeks. Peter was a guy that was incredibly close to Jesus, but Peter was a guy that was a little bit like many of us. He messed up often. And maybe that's just me that messes up often, but Peter was one of those people that did it pretty regularly. I mean, he spoke before thinking more times than I can count, right? Have you ever spoke before thinking?
Yeah.
You guys are perfect. I know. You've never done that before, right? He made mistakes in his faith with Jesus. I mean, he was with Jesus and he made mistakes in his faith. Peter, he slept while he was told by Jesus to pray. Anybody ever fallen asleep while praying before? Or am I the only one? I've never done that, by the way. I'm just kidding. Peter, if you look at the life of Peter, early in his faith, he was actually pretty legalistic in the way that he viewed people. And so Peter, while he had all of these, call them issues about him, what I love about Peter is Jesus looks at this guy that's an ordinary dude, and he says, on you, I'm going to build my church. As screwed up, as messed up, as chaotic as you are, buddy, I'm going to build my church on you. Now, what was interesting about this is Peter got to live at a pretty unique time. If you're not familiar, the New Testament, when the Gospels were written while the nation of Israel was under Roman rule. So Israel was being oppressed by the Romans, and the religious Jews of that time, they were waiting for their Messiah to come. And they believed that the Messiah was coming, finally going to set them free from this Roman rule. So here's what's going on. There's all these things taking place, and here's Peter. He's an ordinary fisherman. Like, he's got no special training, nothing. No, he's not an astute scholar. He hasn't spent time with the rabbis. Like, Peter's just a fisherman. And then Jesus is walking the beach. Jesus sees Peter one day and he calls him to follow him. You can read about that in Matthew chapter 4. But he looks at Peter and he says, hey, you're done fishing for fish, buddy. You are going to be fishing for men. Come and follow me. And so Peter, he begins to follow Jesus. And Peter's, again, he's a unique individual because Peter, if you know his background, he's a Galilean. Now, Galileans of this time, they were very well known for their actions. They were people that you knew by how they acted that they were a Galilean, and not in the good sense. Peter was a fiery man. He had a lot of passion, a lot of excitement, but these Galileans, man, they were just fiery. They were going after things. And they have independence, they have energy, and often those things were directed in the wrong way, and they ended up into turbulence, and it was just kind of messy. And so Peter's this hot-headed Galilean that Jesus is like, hey, come and follow me. But what I love about Peter is he starts at this hot-headed Galilean. If you watch the life of Peter, he grows to be an incredible, devout follower of Jesus, who actually was one of the leaders, what many scholars believe was the leader of the 12 disciples. So Peter's this hot-headed guy you can't keep from sticking his foot in his mouth from time to time. And Jesus says, I'm going to build my church on you. You're going to lead the 12 disciples. And you're a fisherman with no training. So that's Peter. And we're going to look at his life for the next 4 weeks. And we're going to see what can happen when we choose to live a life in full surrender to Jesus and allow him to shape, allow him to mold us. So today I titled the message today, Step Out of the Boat. Step out of the boat. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 14 today, and it's in this passage in Matthew 14 where Jesus, he gives us a perspective on things that we're afraid of. He gives us a perspective of the fear that we wrestle with in life and how, depending on how we respond to that fear that can rise up inside of us, we either sink or we'll experience God in an incredible way. And so Matthew chapter 14, verse 22, here's what it says. It says, immediately after this is Jesus had just got done feeding the 5,000. And so right after Jesus has got done feeding the 5,000, he insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble, far away from the land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once and said, "Don't be afraid." He said, "Take courage, I am here." Then Peter calls to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord!" he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" I read an article this week about the top 10 things that people fear that hold them back in life. So this list of 10 things are the top 10 things that we fear that happen to us, that when we allow these fears to come into our lives, they hold us back from more in life. And in the article, Amy Moore, and she's the therapist that wrote it, she said, whether your fears involve your relationship, your career, death, or discomfort, she says, staying inside your comfort zone will ensure you live a small life. So here's the list. The 10 things that she says, the 10 fears that will hold you back from living a more full life. Number 10 is a loss of freedom. Number 9 is the fear of inadequacy, that fear of not being good enough, not measuring up. Number 8 is the fear of being judged. Number 7, the fear of getting hurt emotionally. Number 6, the fear of something bad happening. Number 5, the fear of uncertainty, that staying safe feeling that we have, and so we don't like to step into uncertainty. But what happens is when we stay in uncertain, we become stagnated, and so we have this fear of uncertainty that holds us back in life. Number 4 is the fear of rejection. Number 3 is the fear of failure. And this fear of failure, it reinforces that fear of inadequacy. So 2 of the top 10 fears are about our inability to measure up, that fear of failure that we carry. The number 2 biggest reason that keeps us from experiencing more in life, that fear, is the fear of loneliness. When the reality is we were created to live life in relationship with people. God created us to live in a relationship, in a community with others. And so we have this fear of being by ourselves because we were created to be in community. I'll get to number 1 a little bit later, so you're going to have to stick with me. But one of the biggest things, when I look at this passage, one of the biggest things that I see is the development of faith. The development of the disciples' faith. In your life, in your faith, if you want growth, step out of the boat. If you want growth in your life, if you want growth in your faith, step out of the boat. The disciples, they had been told by Jesus to cross the lake, and it was taking longer than they expected it to take. And because this storm began to surround them, their fears began to rise up inside of them. Right? They're out in the dark, in the middle of the lake. It's scary. They're out in the dark, in the middle of a lake, without Jesus. Scary. They're out in the dark, in the middle of the lake, without Jesus, in the middle of a storm. It's scary. They're out there, in the middle of the lake, in the middle of the dark, without Jesus, in the middle of a storm. And these guys are terrified for their lives. They're thinking about dying in water. It is a scary place to be. You can imagine the fear that has risen up inside of them and began to paralyze them from making any action. But what's crazy is they're in the middle of a storm and they're doing exactly what Jesus asked them to do. Jesus said, hey, get in a boat, cross the lake. They're doing exactly what Jesus asked them to do. They were in the will of God, and a storm still came. If you read the Bible, you read it enough, you're going to see there's 2 types of storms. There's the storms of correction when God disciplines, and there's the storms of perfection when God helps us grow. The Old Testament story of Jonah. Jonah was a storm of correction because Jonah chose to run the complete opposite way of God telling him. And so Jonah had a storm of correction. He was being disciplined by God. But here's the disciples. They're out doing the will of God. They're in the will of God, and the storm still comes. They're being perfected in their faith. They're being perfected. I wish that I could tell you that when you say yes to following Jesus, life is going to be great and easy. I wish that I could stand here and say, when you follow Jesus, man, it is peaceful waters and easy navigation. I wish that I could say, when you follow Jesus, life is always going to be fun. But you know that I can't do that. Because the reality is, whether you follow Jesus or not, storms still come in your life. Storms are still coming after us. But the thing about the struggles that we have in life is in the middle of the storm, we have the opportunity to experience Jesus. We can experience Jesus in the middle of the storm. The disciples, they're out in the water. They're being tormented by these waves. It says, if you look at the Greek text, they're being tormented as they're out there in the middle of the storm. And they see what they think is a ghost walking towards them. They find out it's Jesus. And then there's Peter. Peter does what many of us would consider to be pretty reckless. He says, oh, it's you, Jesus. And this is what he says in verse 28. Lord, if it's really you, then tell me to come to you walking on the water. And Jesus says, yes, come. It made absolutely zero sense for Peter to step out of the boat. Remember, Peter's a fisherman. So he had grown up on the water. He had been around the water. And every single other time Peter took a step out of the boat, guess what happened? Down he went. But here he is in the middle of a storm, in the middle of a mess. And he's like, all right, Jesus, if it's really you, I need some faith. And I'm going to step out of this boat. What are you thinking? Now, many of us, here's the thing about this. Many of us, we often, I shouldn't say many. If you're like me, I'll put it this way. If you're like me, you think that boat is like a little small, like crabbing kind of boat or something like a little fishing boat you put on the river that's got like these little 3-foot sides and you just kind of like step out of the boat. Hey, big step of faith, right? No. These boats are very different. I actually got the opportunity to visit Israel, and they have this place called the Jesus boat. It's kind of a replica of they found at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee that they pulled up, and now it's in this museum and stuff. But there's a picture we're going to put on the screen for you of what this boat looked like. So this boat, it wasn't this small little like step over the edge boat. It was like some of these boats had like 5-foot sidewalls. So in order for Peter to step out of the boat, it wasn't a little like step of faith, like up and over, here we go. It was like a, holy cow, I got to launch myself up, and I'm sitting on the edge. I really got to take the chance to step out and to get out of this boat. He had to make a conscious decision to do this. And I look at this and I'm like, why? Why would Peter ever step away from the security that he's got? Like, remember, there's a storm raging. It's not like it's peaceful waters and he steps out of the boat. It is a raging, tormentuous storm, and he steps out of the boat. He steps away from his security. Why, Peter, would you step deeper into the storm? Why would you even ask Jesus to walk on water? Because you know that you've never walked on water the entire time you've been a fisherman. And yet here's Peter. He takes a step out into uncertainty. He takes a step out into unreliability. He takes a step out into unpredictability. And he was able to experience an incredible demonstration of God's power. Because he stepped out of the boat. When we choose faith over fear, we open ourselves to experience the power of Christ in our lives. Why? Because Jesus is with us in the storms. Amen. He's with us in the storms. The Old Testament prophet Isaiah says it. He says, when you go through deep waters, I will be with you. Jesus speaking. When you go through deep waters, when you go through storms, I will be with you. When you go through the rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. When you walk through the fire of oppression, you will not be burned up. The flames will not consume you. God is with you. In his book, If You Want to Walk on Water, You Have to Get Out of the Boat, John Ortberg, he says this. He says, there's always fear. God has an inextinguishable habit of asking people to do things that are scary to them. It may be a fear of inadequacy, a fear of failure, a fear of God. But one way or another, there will always be fear. But then he goes on to say, there's always a call. God asks an ordinary person to engage in an act of extraordinary trust, that of getting out of the boat. You see, when you do things that no one else does, you experience what no one else does. When you do things that nobody else is going to do, nobody else will take that step of faith, nobody else will make that decision, you will experience things that nobody else will experience. Peter, he makes a bold decision to step out of the boat. He did something that nobody else did. He steps out of the boat, but because he took that step, he experienced God in a way that nobody else has. Because he took that bold step of faith. The last few months here at the church and at my house has been filled with a lot of prayer and a lot of conversations as we figure out what the next season, what the next chapter of Grace Point Fellowship is going to look like. as a staff, as a leadership team, we're making bold decisions about what the next season looks like. And we're doing it not allowing the waves that are crashing around us to separate us from what we feel like Jesus is calling us to do. When the nation of Israel was in the middle of a leadership transition, God gave them this word in Joshua 1:9. He said, "This is my command, to be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go."
Amen.
Be strong, be courageous, be bold. Why? For the Lord is with you wherever you go. Peter didn't know what was going to come from stepping out of the boat. But when Jesus said, "Come," guess what? He stepped. So as a church, we're being courageous. We're trusting the promise of God that wherever he leads, he's going to be there. He's going with us. The number one fear that article talked about, that number one fear that holds us back from experiencing more in life, is change. The number one fear is change. We live in an ever-changing world. It is constantly changing, faster than it ever has before. But what happens is, because of this fear of change, it can cause us to miss out on good opportunities that come our way. Because of this fear of change, we run the risk of being stagnant and staying stuck in the rut that we were never meant to be in. Whether it's struggling just to change with technology, whether it's struggling to change a relationship, struggle to change your finances, change your job, change your health, change your thoughts even. Change is hard. Change is hard for all of us. It can cause that fear to rise up deep inside of us. I can only imagine Peter, who's making this choice if he's going to step out of the boat or not. Jesus says, "Come." So Peter steps up on the edge of the boat, and I can only imagine the knees shaking, the sweaty palms that he's got, the fear that's beginning to rise up of what happens in the middle of the storm. If I step off the boat, am I going to stand or am I going to sink? And yet, what does Peter do? He steps off the boat. He steps in faith, believing that God was going to watch over him. And because he took that step of faith, he experienced Jesus like nobody else has ever experienced Jesus. So you may be here today, and you might be older than me, which, let's be honest, that's most of us.
Yeah.
You may be here and you may be older than me, and you're like, "Great, we got this young guy that's come in and he's got ideas, and where am I going to fit in this next chapter at Grace Point? He's young, he's got energy, that's great, but what about me? Where am I going to fit in? How am I going to be part of this vision that he's talking about?" I want you to know my heart for this church is for this church to be a multi-generational church. What does a multi-generational church mean? That's a big word, and we have an understanding. But what do I mean by a multi-generational church? This is what I mean. It means as we move forward, we're going to gear to the young. Why? Because we do not want our church to have an expiration date. We don't want to get old and be done, and so we will always gear to the young, but we will lean into the wisdom of the wise because they've been down the road before, and there is wisdom with the wise. And they will be part of things should they choose. They're not cast aside and just counselors, because everybody needs to be engaged in the mission of God. The problem is, we hear this struggle, and we hear it through our own generational biases. So all the young people are like, "Great, man, finally, this young guy's taking charge, and he's going to go do stuff that I want to do." And all the old people hear it like, "Thank goodness, this young kid, he needs to finally lean into my wisdom. We've got so much to offer." We hear it through our generational biases. And yet this is one of the many reasons why I'm glad for the staff that we've got. Because you might not realize it, but the staff that we have, just about all of them are twice my age. And I'm grateful for it. I enjoy spending time with them because they have an incredible wealth of wisdom. And they've walked the path before. And what I love about the staff that is twice my age is that they're on board with where we're going. They see the big picture. They see the fact that, yes, we are maybe a little bit older than Josh is, but we are not done yet. We can still be used by God. And so they're engaged. They're on board. Because we wouldn't be moving if the staff wasn't with me. I'm going to tell you that right now. They're older and they're engaged because they don't want this church to have an expiration date. And so they're moving forward with me. They're not concerned about being left out because they're part of the process. They're part of the church. They are engaged in what's happening. And they understand that their wisdom is incredibly important as we move into the next chapter of Grace Point Fellowship. But the thing about following God is it's proactive. When you have a relationship with Jesus, it is a proactive thing because you can say yes to him and then you can sit on your butt and do nothing, and you're never going to grow. You want to grow in your faith, you have to be proactive in your faith. And so what do I mean by this? When I use this phrase of describing a multi-generational church, it means that we all, no matter our age, need to be proactive in it. So when I say we're going to gear to the young, the proactivity is the wise generation. It is your responsibility to make sure that we're gearing young. And the young generation, your proactivity is to make sure that you are leaning into the wisdom of the wise. We need both generations to come together to move forward, to expand the kingdom of Christ. It isn't just young people and it's not just old people. It is both of us combined because in the family of God there are no divisions. We are united as one. And so for many of us, you hear that and you're like, well, I'm not coming back next Sunday. That's okay. No, I'm just kidding. You're like, that's a little bit uncomfortable. That's out of my comfort zone. I'm gonna wrestle with this. It's stretching me a little bit. In life, you can't grow without being stretched. You can't grow without being stretched. You want to grow in your faith, you have to be stretched in your faith. You have to be stretched. It's like a rubber band, I think. This is a nice big rubber band that's really comfortable. If I want this rubber band to grow in length, what do I have to do? Got to stretch it. Right here, it's comfortable. I can put it around my head. I'm not going to have any worries about it, nothing like that. But when you stretch it, there's growth. But what also happens when you stretch it and you see the growth, there's tension. There's tension. But tension is a good thing. There's a reason why Proverbs says iron sharpens iron. There's good things in the tension, and so we have to have growth. There is always growth in the stretch. When you are stretched, that's where the growth comes from. In your life, in the storms you face, in the struggles you come across, growth happens when you're stretched. But when the stretch happens, fear comes in. Fear begins to rise up in each of us. And so the question is, how will you respond? How will you respond when you're stretched? When that fear begins to rise up? Will you sink in fear? Or will you stand in faith? Because doubt and fear always go together. But faith and peace always go together. How are you going to respond. The disciples, they had been toiling, they had been struggling, they had been challenged all night as they used their own power, as they rowed that boat, as they worked hard together in their own strength to try and get to the other side of the lake, and they never made it on their own strength. But the moment Jesus stepped in, instantaneously, they achieved their objective. They tried doing it by themselves and they weren't getting anywhere. But when Jesus met them in the middle, all was calmed. So no matter what storm you're facing in life, and if you follow Jesus, he's going to see you through it. When Jesus says, come, that word is going to accomplish its intended purpose. There's a reason that Jesus is called the author and perfecter of our faith, the author and finisher of our faith in Hebrews chapter 12. Because whatever he starts, he completes. Whatever he starts, he completes. And the reality is, we may fail along the way. But even though we fail, he will succeed. God will succeed. And so Jesus and Peter, they walk on the water together back to the boat. It's a story that many people know, many people have heard. But a question that doesn't often get asked, why did Jesus walk on the water? Why did Jesus walk on the water? I think Jesus walked on the water to show his disciples that the very thing that they feared, the sea, was only a staircase for him to come to them. The thing that they were most afraid of was the thing that he had power over. Often in life, when we face, or we have this fear of facing difficult things, difficult circumstances, whether it's loss of a job, loss of a home, loss of a loved one, loss of finances. We fear these things, but when they actually happen, they actually usually bring us closer to Jesus. When that happens, don't miss the message in the miracle. Don't miss the message in the middle of the miracle that Jesus is trying to show you. Jesus showed his disciples that he had power over the sea. He had power over nature. He walked on the very thing that his disciples were afraid of. This miracle, it shows the importance of total reliance on Jesus Christ. The difference between fear and faith is focus. What are you looking at? Where's your gaze? Where are you looking? What will you focus on? You're going to focus on the comfort of staying in the boat, where it's secure, safe? Or will you gaze at Jesus, the one who has power over the water, power over the waves? I love that song that we sang earlier this morning, Oceans. In the bridge of that song, it says, the lines will be up behind me, but it says, Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the water wherever you would call me. Church, we are being led by God. And we are being strong and courageous because God is with us wherever we go.
Amen.
So whatever we fear, whether it's change, whether it's failure, whether it's uncertainty, whether it's loss, whatever fears that we have, we can focus on them or we can focus on Jesus. The question is, will you step out of the boat? I'll say it this way. If you want to grow, then out you go. Get out of the boat. If you want to grow in your faith, get out of your comfort zone and let Jesus show you an experience like you've never had before. Would you pray with me?